Hello everybody, and thank you for joining us for the second ALNAP webinar on Incident Command and Incident Management Systems and Leadership. For those of you who missed it, our first webinar on this topic was given by Arne Howitt and Joe Pfeiffer, and they gave us a very good grounding in the basics of incident management systems. You can catch that if you didn't get it first time around on the ALNAP website. Go to what we do on the home page, leadership, click through to that and you'll find the webinar is at the bottom of the page. As some of you will know, this series of webinars and series of work came out of our work on leadership at ALNAP. The particular report was Between Chaos and Control, which you can see now on your screens. And one of the recommendations of Chaos and Control, which was looking at what we could do to improve operational leadership and humanitarian response, was that the international humanitarian actors and national humanitarian actors could usefully learn from the insights and experiences of civil defense and other agencies who've done so much work in looking at how to manage and respond to incidents and emergencies. So to follow that recommendation up, we've been trying to bring together the experiences of civil defense organizations, fire services and others, and of ALNAP members and other humanitarian agencies. And we're delighted that today, for this second webinar, we're going to be able to take a look at how two agencies, World Vision and Medecins Sans Frontières, have thought about and used some of the principles of incident command in their own work. We're going to take a look at some of the questions about, what works and what transfers, and what perhaps doesn't work, and what have we learned, what can we do better as a result of using some of these ideas from outside the sector. So I'm absolutely delighted that we have three great presenters for you today. Not me, I'm the one at the top, but if you look at the panel there on the screen, starting from the left, Alexandra Levaditis, I'm sorry Alexandra, I think I mangled your family name, has served as the Capacity Building and Organisational Development Director for World Vision's Humanitarian Emergency Affairs Unit since 2010. One of her responsibilities here is overseeing the team that has developed World Vision's adaptation of the Incident Command System and establishing it as World Vision's organising framework for emergency response. Currently, this includes making adjustments based on 2 years of application and continuing to promote and build use through simulations and learning reviews. So Alexandra and team have a lot to tell us about what works in the transfer and some of the challenges perhaps and strengths of moving this into a humanitarian organisation. And she's joined today by Jimmy Nadapdap, who's worked for World Vision for more than 16 years in mostly, not exclusively, but mostly in relief and humanitarian crises. He's got a sort of roll call of deployments as long as your arm. He was one of the first World Vision staff to enter Aceh following the December earthquake and tsunami. He served as rapid response team leader in that, and it has played leadership roles also in emergency responses in the Solomon Islands, in India, in Afghanistan, in Azerbaijan, in Myanmar, Mauritania, West Africa, Turkey, Syria, cross-border operations, Typhoon Haiyan, and I don't know where else. So Jimmy has a remarkable on-the-ground experience and will be able to speak to some of the things that he's learned and some of the ways that some of these ideas can actually be put into practice on the ground. And then last but by no means least, we have Sean Healy. Sean is a humanitarian advisor for MSF UK. He started life as a journalist and with an academic background in international political economy, and then joined MSF in 2002 as a press officer, but moved fairly rapidly into managing humanitarian operations in the field as project coordinator in Burundi, Kashmir and Baluchistan, head of mission in Lao PDR, and as desk officer for the Red Cross's programs in the Tibetan Autonomous Region of China. Since 2011, he's worked as a humanitarian advisor for MSF. And with that broad field background and sort of understanding of ICS, he's one of the many things that he's been doing there is thinking about how responses can be improved by bringing some of these principles in. So we have a great panel today. and very much looking forward to what they have to say. So with no further ado, I think we will go straight to Alexandra to tell us a little bit about World Vision's experience.
Good morning, everybody, or good afternoon, wherever you are. Thanks, Paul, for that introduction. As Paul said, that my team has been responsible for designing and integrating EMS, the Emergency Management System, as we call our adaptation of the Incident Command System in World Vision, for the past 2+ years. So what I'm going to do is give a little bit of an overview of our experience and the reasons behind our adoption of ICS, and then hand it over to my colleague Jimmy Nadapdap, who will share more of an operational example of the high-on response and how we were able to adopt EMS in the high-on response. So why did we adopt ICS in the first place? One of the primary reasons was that World Vision is a large and fairly complex organization. We have a federated governance model, which means that we have multiple actors within the organization who have multiple interests that need to be recognized and managed. So in the past, there was a tendency within our organization to try to, in a sense, ring-fence the response team so that they were able to carry on and manage the response and not be in some cases what were viewed as interruptions from the rest of the organization who needed information, had different needs from the response team. And what ICS was able to give to us was a clear articulation of roles and responsibilities, not only within the response team, but also within the rest of the organization. So it was uniquely well suited for the needs of our organization. Another reason is often, as many of us know, there's a lot of confusion when a response is declared within our organizations and when an emergency happens around who does what. There's generally confusion between a response team and, in our case, a national office where World Vision has a pre-existing presence, as well as the response and the rest of the World Vision partnership around who does what. This often meant that many actors who had a stake in various aspects of the response sought to either make operational decisions remotely from outside the response because they felt that they had to have their interests met, and that was the only way to do it, or it wasn't really entirely clear who was accountable to leadership for which kinds of decisions. So in some cases it's the response manager, in some cases it's the national director, which is the head of our country offices. In some cases it may be a regional emergencies director, and that wasn't always clear previous to the adoption of ICS. And this was despite the fact that we had long-standing what we call disaster management standards in place. But those standards were generally a bit higher level, and they didn't go into the detail of who does what, as we have now with terms of reference and standard operating guidance that came about with our adoption of ICS. We needed to articulate the competencies that were required to actually do the job. In the past, a lot of our capacity building, while it was focused also on technical training, there was a lot of sort of uniform core skills that were built across response positions, which were needed, but we realized we also needed a much more tailored approach so that competencies were built specifically for staff to be able to do the job that was their primary responsibility to do. So while we still continue to build competencies in core areas like humanitarian standards, there's much more focus on thinking, well, what does a finance manager actually need to know in order to be able to respond? And we try to tailor our programs now based on those our capacity building programs based on those competencies. And finally, we needed to learn to speak the same language across the organization because much of our surge capacity comes from various parts of the organization. So as I mentioned before, World Vision is a federated agency. We have sort of what we call the other side of the organization. From our humanitarian sides, our development colleagues, and a lot of our surge capacity is drawn from our development sector. And as we all know, that those of us that work in NGOs that are multi-mandate, humanitarian staff and development staff tend to speak different languages, have different work styles, different approaches, and we needed to have those, we needed to have everybody on the same page when a response happens, so we don't have that negotiation and that discussion at the start of a response, but it's all taking place before the emergency actually happens. How we applied ICS in World Vision, I'm just going to give a few of the highlights because it's been a fairly long process. We started by doing extensive research and consultation in the design phase. So we had approximately 2 years from 2010 to 2012 of what we've called a design phase. There was a small team dedicated to developing and implementing ICS in that period. We had a lot of external discussions with multiple agencies in Australia and the US and other places, learning a lot from emergency services and applying ICS. So a lot of the discussion that was had on the first webinar in this series is some of the discussions that we had during that period to try to understand how the fire services in different countries, how other emergency services adopted and used ICS. The learning from those consultations was brought to the organization, and then we had internal consultations at leadership levels and operational levels to think about how ICS should be adapted to our agency. The adoption and design of ICS, I would say, was driven extensively by the Asia region and was tinkered with in the Asia region to meet the needs of multiple emergencies. And this was especially useful because there's a lot of obviously rapid onset emergencies in Asia. So it gave us a lot of opportunity to test things out, to see what worked, to adapt, and to build capacity in a sort of a more concentrated area instead of trying to apply it all at once in the organization. There was a lot of support in the Asia region for this, so there was kind of the perfect conditions to be able to learn, to roll out, to tinker, to adapt in the Asia region. And this was done extensively through a lot of simulations. We held a good amount of simulations through real emergency responses, through consultations, workshops, training sessions, and through consultations with leadership. Our discussions around ICS came about at a time in the organization where we were moving more and more towards a kind of a stricter line management approach. So our ICS was designed with our organization's governance and management structures in mind. As our organization moved more and more to line management, we assigned responsibilities to relevant leadership in the response, in our national office, our country office, in our regional offices, and globally, in line with a sort of line management approach. And it was critical for us to be able to address accountabilities beyond solely the response team, but also to look at leadership responsibilities outside the response team. So what's the role of our regional office? What's the role of our global leadership in terms of a response and accountabilities for a response? So just to give an example around that, the development of a response strategy, for example, we've assigned the responsibility for the development of a response strategy to the response manager. However, the national director of a country office where we have a pre-existing presence is responsible for approving that response strategy because we wanted to make sure that there was alignment between the response and then the overall national office strategy where we've had problems with that in the past. And finally, you've probably heard me intermixing EMS and ICS just out of habit using our organizational jargon. But we needed to adapt ICS to our organizational context. And one of the things that was involved with that was changing the name of it to fit more organizational context and to fit more of a humanitarian sort of way of looking at the world. So we've termed it the Emergency Management System, or EMS. So you'll probably be hearing me using that acronym quite a lot during this presentation, as you'll be hearing Jimmy using the same acronym. But what this meant is that we made some adaptation to the terminology that's used in ICS that you probably heard in the first webinar if you were a participant. We changed some of the functions that you probably heard described in the first webinar, as well as the structure. So we modified it to fit our needs, but maintained I think the integrity of the principles and the overall approach of ICS. We also emphasized a lot of capacity building and resource development. So you'll see kind of a smattering of some of that on the screen. We developed a wide range of resources to raise awareness of EMS across multiple levels of the organization, so across leadership levels and operational levels. But materials were really tailored to meet the audience. I think that was important. We developed kind of one-page overviews of EMS, more traditional PowerPoints for leadership. We developed videos, modules, video clips, simulation materials. You'll see on this screen examples of an online EMS manual that we've just recently started rolling out to give everyone access, easy access to the previous hard copy EMS manual that we had. As I mentioned, video clips that are kind of 3-minute overviews of specific topics of EMS. This one is on unity of command. E-module simulation material. So we've emphasized to a very large extent trying to raise awareness and build capacity in using EMS. So the EMS principles. We've basically maintained the principles of ICS that you would have seen in the first webinar. We made some changes to the terminology, but where we have made a few changes is in the definition of each of the principles. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about that, but because we tried to apply the principles to a humanitarian context and specifically to our organizational context. So management by objective, I'll just go through some of the definitions because I think they're relevant to trying to think about how ICS is adopted to humanitarian context. For management by objective, the definition that we have is that every response is driven by a clear and well-communicated response strategy and plan based on needs. This provides a common focus for all stakeholders that may adapt due to changes in context. So the focus of management by objective is really setting your response strategy for the context and making it adaptable and flexible so that it can change over the course of a response when the context merits that or changes. Unity of command. Every position has a clearly defined role, set of responsibilities, and is accountable to a single line manager to simplify work and reduce reduction. Flexible and temporary structure. I think this is something that we talk about quite a lot. What's the life term of an EMS structure? Is it temporary? Is it long-term? Can it apply to different sorts of situations? So we've defined the EMS structure as a temporary structure. It can be rapidly established, scaled up and down based on the changing needs of a response. Its flexibility includes ability to add and remove positions based on context. Span of control. The way we've defined span of control is the number of direct reports a manager has is limited to 7 or fewer. This increases efficiency and ensures that staff are adequately supported in their roles in a complex context. So you'll see when I show some of the examples of the structures that we've applied for EMS, we've made sure that we've maintained this principle. Common terminology. So we have standard terminology, which I talked about a little bit earlier, to make sure to reduce misunderstanding, especially between the different parts of our organization. And then competency-based staffing, which is a critical component for us, that positions at all levels are staffed on the basis of validated ability to meet the demands of the role. So within World Vision, we have a pretty large pool of surge capacity that's registered on our internal system for those that have qualifications for specific functions of EMS. So our whole surge capacity register and system has been set up according to EMS functions, and then staff are validated by global technical and emergency specialists in a particular functional area of EMS. So I just wanted to share with you the functions, and you'll see that this is not set up as a structure or an org chart, and this was very important for us. There was a lot of concern when we were establishing EMS that we were trying to put in place a very large structure to manage every response. And the way we've tried to really emphasize in EMS is that it's not about the structure, it's about the functions that are represented within any kind of structure that you may have to manage a response. So you'll see on this screen, or on this slide, there's 6 basic functions that need to be represented in every response. So there needs to be a response manager who leads the response. A support services group, which is a little bit different than what is represented in a traditional ICS structure, where that's usually represented by logistics. But we've grouped together a range of different support functions into this grouping. So it includes human resources, it includes ICT, logistics, supply chain, and finance, and that support services. And their primary function is to resource the response. The next function you'll see here is programs. So again, that's a little bit different from the ICS structure, which talks about planning, although the function is, definition is similar, but we've used the programs language, which is more typically used in a humanitarian context. And the function of the programs unit is to design and improve the response design based on data and to collect data. The next grouping is around operations, I think, which is fairly similar to what you'll see in an ICS context. It's about implementing. Liaison, and in liaison we've grouped, again, a range of different kinds of stakeholder management groups. So we've grouped advocacy, communications, and government and other sorts of liaison functions in that grouping. And security. So again, that's quite similar to ICS. So these are the basic functions that should be represented in every response. Whether these functions are represented by one person, if it's a very, very small scale flood in a local area, or they're represented by, a response managed by 20, 30, 40 people is dependent on the needs of that response. But these are the functions that need to be present in every emergency response. So I won't talk too much about structure because I know the last webinar went extensively into the discussion of the ICS structure. But this is the most basic response structure that we would have, where each function is represented, possibly by one person, or it could be by 5 people, depending on the needs of the response. So these are the way the functions get translated into a structure. This would be an example of a response that's more of a medium scale. So you'll see where we've grouped some of the functional areas that I talked about. Under programming, for example, we've grouped DM&E, information management, and humanitarian accountability. There's different ways we could have done this. We had a lot of discussion as to whether sectors should be under operations or should be under programs, depending on how you define their primary function. Is their primary function to implement? Is their primary function to design? And I think we'll talk a little bit more about that because that continues to be a challenge for us. So this is what something kind of a medium scale response may look like. And this is an example of what a large scale response may look like. So again, this is very adaptable. It could be larger, it could be less. You could have 1 zone, 2 zones, 3 zones, depending on the response. But it obviously represents the ability of ICS or EMS to expand or contract depending on the needs of our context. And then finally, one thing that I wanted to talk about, because a lot of the discussion has been around the actual response team, something that was very important for us, as I mentioned earlier, was to also make sure that the roles and responsibilities beyond the response team were quite clear. So one of the things that in the design of our EMS, we've tried to really emphasize looking at various levels of response, strategy and then policy level. So we try to look at every level of the organization, from our global organization down to kind of the zonal level of a response. So at a policy level, we've tried to define the roles of what we call in our organization a regional leader, which would be more like a regional director, a regional vice president, that has responsibility for setting policy, and he's kind of at a strategic level representing the partnership, the World Vision partnership, and has overall accountability for a response. At a strategy level, this is more at a national level, and this is at the level of a country director or a national director who has responsibility for the long-term strategic direction of the national program and ensuring that the response and the national program are in alignment. At an operational level, this is primarily at a national level again, but this is looking more at a response level. So each of the EMS functions have developed objectives which we've put in place in terms of references, performance objectives, standard operating guidance, and they're accountable to each person, and each function is accountable to meeting those. At a tactical level, that's usually kind of at a national level, but at more a field level or a zonal level or administrative level. So these are multifunctional field teams which develop and manage the delivery of detailed response plans to beneficiaries. We've developed standard operating procedures for response teams, for regional leaders, and for response managers. But we've tried to define the accountabilities across the organization to make it clear who has responsibility for making which kinds of decisions at all the various levels of a response. So I think that's been a really important, not only lesson, but an important aspect of ICS or EMS for us, because we are a federated organization, multi-mandated organization, and it was just as important to define those levels of accountability as it was to define the function of an operations manager in a response. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Jimmy Nadapdap, who's going to talk a little bit about the Haiyan response and what this all looked like in operations in the Haiyan response, as Jimmy was the first response manager that was deployed there.
Thank you, Alexandra. Good morning and good afternoon for everyone on the call. So let me just explain now more on the in terms of what's happening in the field during the Haiyan response. So yeah, Haiyan happened and hit the Philippines on the 8th of November 2013. Actually, after within 8 hours, I'm based here in Singapore, so I'm supporting the country from Singapore. Within 8 hours after the disaster strike, the national office or the country office has declared the response as a national office response. So just a bit of background about the country. World Vision Philippines has been in the, has been operating in the country for the last 50 years already. I think this year will be their 50 years anniversary. They have a multi-mandate, multi-mandate objective, as Alexandra has been explaining before, issue around development, issue around advocacy and disaster management. That's basically the overall objective of the operational in the country. So less than 24 hours after the disaster, I arrived in the Philippines, and then it's been mentioned before that I was in tsunami back in 2004 in Banda Aceh, and I can understand based on the information from the media, based from the information from the field as well as from the UN, the news, that this is big. This is beyond the the category 1, the national office response that has been declared before. Sorry, it wasn't category 3, like the highest category, but the management still with the country office. So after I arrived, then we basically upgrading the category of the emergency into the highest level within World Vision, which is category 3, global response. I will explain about that one a little bit later. So then within 2 weeks after the emergency declared, large number of deployment has been happening with the response, and all the sources coming from the national office, from the regional office, South Asia Pacific, East Asia region, as well as from the global office, from the partnership office. So 50 international staff and 350 national staff deployed this within 2 weeks after the disaster declared. So I was the first response manager for this response. Literally I use the EMS as my guidance, and as a seasoning relief worker, then I'm very thankful that this one is available very timely when Haiyan hits and when Haiyan happened. So the factors that contributing to the application of the EMS in the Haiyan response is the investment in capacity, very extensive investment in the capacity. I guess the discussion before during the trial period, during the development period from 2010 to 2012. It's just the question is not that whether we need this or not. But how to develop this, because the context in Asia is disaster, natural disaster prone area. Almost, that's what the statistics said. That's what the experience said. So series of training, workshop, consultation across the Asia Pacific, involving the regional office, country office such as Philippines, Thailand, Indonesia, India, and others country. Basically happening between 2010 to 2012, part of the investment and then development of EMS. And also, factor that contributing this, the EMS provide objective framework for principle-based discussion. Basically, this help us like myself as the response team, and as also the World Vision Philippines as the national office on the same page. This is the discussion that we have at the beginning, when I arrived on the 9th of November, seeing the scale of the emergency. The discussion is about what's the objective, what's the objective that we want to see, and then what's basically the control that we want to see. So it's not about that. That the global office want to dictate or just to replace everybody on the ground, but basically, okay, the objective is that we want to respond one of the largest emergency, and we need people that has the capacity to do that. So the discussion about the principle base really helped. I was sitting with all the member of the senior leadership team at that time, and literally explained to them about that we will do this, and we will have the global response, we will do EMS, and also explain about what will be the role of the national office, as Alexandra explains before in the charts, in terms of the what's the policy level, the strategy level, what will be the role. So again, explaining and clarifying the role is very important, because it's not that we just basically remove your role, but basically what happened at the time was to clarify the role of about, okay, what will be the role of the global team or the the surge capacity, what will be the role of the national office. So the principle, based discussion really helpful rather than just, talking about this person or that particular person will come and lead and start to, basically, do everything based on what we want to do. So it's not the discussion at the time. And the other factor also that contribute to the EMS application during the high-end response is the commitment and the experience with EMS across the response leadership. I think I count, Alexandra show you the function, the role and function before, from the response manager, which is at the time was me. I was there from November to January, to ops manager, to program manager, to support service manager, liaison, as well as security. Like, yeah, the knowledge and then the understanding is vary from people to, from people to people, but certainly, like, they across the board that everybody has the knowledge and expertise, as well as the commitment with the EMS. The last one also, the factor that contribute to the EMS application, I think everybody familiar about the operations in Philippines is large. We are talking about island. We are operating in a 3 big island from eastern part of Leyte, central Leyte, as well as western part of Leyte. We need almost like 4 to 5 hours to fly, go through Manila, etc., before we can move island. So just seeing the unified command management by objective span of control is just not possible to operate under one framework. We need to delegate that one responsibility to zonal leadership. This is the one that we also use, EMS in practice. I think a lot has been said in this discussion. We still have a lot of things to do as well. It's not that everything perfect, that we just, everything perfect and everything in place. A lot still need to be done. So the first one that, that we still need to continue to do is basically to clarify and to being familiar staff with regional function and global level leadership. In World Vision, we are working in a 7 regional office, and not everybody on the same page and same understanding, same level of buy-in also for this one. While emergency happen across the seven regions, so then continue to clarify, especially with the global leadership, is very key. The next one that we'll continue to do is basically to clarify roles as well between program and operation. Just again, as has been said before, that this is the result of a very extensive discussion, research, review from 2010 to 2012. We just tested and then still have some issue here and there. The role between program and operations, which one is planned, which one is implement, especially when it comes to funding availability in terms of the project deliverable. There are still some issue in an operational level or in a tactical level. So this is something that we as an organization will continue to work on to clarify roles. And also, while we will push the EMS across the region, we also, like what we did in Asia Pacific in terms of to familiarize this leadership and others with the principle and the EMS frame itself. I mean, easily people will just say that when they heard about EMS, when they see about EMS, oh, that's the structure, and people will be intimidated by the structure, that the large structure that will be required if you need or if you use EMS. That's something that we need to continue to clarify with people across the organization. This is beyond structure. This is beyond, like, this is definitely beyond structure, given the nature, the culture in the organization. This is beyond structure. How people based on competency actually the one that will be in charge, rather than based on seniority, because then people might come from a different what we call it in our organization ministry, from development, from advocacy, to do emergency response. Is it is it effective? Not necessary. Why? Because of course that the competency requirement. So that's something that we will continue in terms of really to continue being familiar with the principle and then the frame. The rethinking of support services, again, we learn also that especially the role of finance and the role of HR, human resource, is always required and needed to be very close with the response management, because they are the response director, response manager, because that's the time when we want to make decision in terms of the allocation of resources or allocation of money, while at the time we put that under the support service management, support service director. That's something that we continue to review, as well as also it's not, we found out that it's not easy to find the competent staff to be the support service manager, those that understand the nitty-gritty across finance, across HR, across logistics, across supply chains, across IT. So that's the other thing that World Vision as organization will continue to work on. The next one also, to strengthen sector focus and competency development. The beauty of EMS basically to inform, being, to inform and being, this is the requirement, that competency that required in order to do this. We've been exposed to that one. And it's not always necessary that is the capacity that currently, exists present in the organization. So then we need to continue to strengthen, especially on a competency development. More consultation on application in slow onset context. Again, has been explained that EMS has been developed in Asia region, where the context more on rapid onset, while we are disseminating this also with colleagues, especially from Africa. There are some discussion also in terms of how how applicable this framework for a slow onset context. This is another thing that we'll continue to discuss. So I think with that, I just want to end this this presentation from World Vision, while Alexandra explained about the concept and principle, and I just explained to you about what's happening in the Philippines during the Haiyan and how we implement EMS that we adopted from ICS for the emergency response in Haiyan. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jimmy and Alexandra. It's clear that that World Vision has done a vast amount of work here in bringing these ideas forward within the organisation. World Vision has done a lot of work on this, as has MSF, two quite different organisations, and I think it's interesting to compare and contrast the experiences of both of them. So I'd like to hand straight over to you, Sean, to tell us a little bit about what MSF has done and what you've learnt around Incident Command.
So, I mean, the first thing I'd say is that we've done nowhere near the amount of work that World Vision has done on it. So that's a very heavy caveat from the start. We've been looking at it for a relatively short period of time in comparison, and we're certainly nowhere near as far down the path in terms of implementing it or incorporating it into our own plans. So I want to go through first, just to give you also a couple of other caveats. What I'm principally talking about is the work which has been done on this issue by listeners might know that MSF has 5 operational centres, so we're principally talking about the one based in Amsterdam. Although all of the operational centres are going through similar processes to reconsider and to look at, and in some cases restructure mission coordination structures, which is really what we're talking about in our case. We looked at ICSs in a particular context, and that was in the context of a review of our mission coordination structures. That is the teams in country at capital level which manage the overall mission. So as opposed to our projects, which might be in particular field locations, hospitals in the most classical example, these are the country level, such as I'm sitting in Delhi now, such as our colleagues here who are sitting in Delhi coordinating the different programs that exist in the country. This review was carried out after a number of years where we felt that our coordinations were under particular strains, and so we wanted to look at what the character of those strains were and what some of the underlying issues might have been. So you can see our assessment of the current state, which is up on your screen, was more or less what we found in talking to various people at various levels in the field. We conducted a survey, we conducted key informant interviews, and this was kind of the thing that we got. I don't think this is enormously MSF specific. I think this would probably be familiar with many humanitarians, a certain tendency towards people in key positions being completely overloaded in terms of the responsibilities. In our cases, it particularly meant the heads of mission and the medical coordinators. Also somewhat of a tendency towards centralization, towards decisions moving up the chain, and a certain tendency towards a rather individualized performance, so that it really depended on the personality or the particular skills or competencies of the head of mission or the medical coordinator as to whether one program was a great success or another was moderately successful or another one was a bit of a fizzer. So when we were looking at why this might be, one of the particular things is a lot of the issue is related to the growth. And again, I don't think this is specific to MSF. I think many humanitarian agencies have grown considerably over the last 10 years. But if we look at our field operations over the last 5-6 years, we're talking about very significant growth in spending, in staff headcounts for both nationals and expatriates. And in our case, most of this had been in the field, so it's not therefore very surprising that the job of coordinators was starting to get overwhelmed. In MSF, we had a structure which was always very predictable, which you can see on your screen there, that in any given capital there were always 4 key positions, plus the project coordinator PC that you see there, which is the person in the field managing the hospital or whatever it might be, the particular program or intervention, and that had never really changed. It didn't matter whether you were in country X, Y, or Z, it was more or less always the same structure. Over the last 5 years, we'd gone more to a situation where every mission was designing its own structure depending on what its needs were, depending on whether it was, for example, a highly technical program or whether it was a very large program, for example, in a complex emergency, whether it was an emergency, like a short-term, e-desk intervention, emergency desk intervention. All of these structures were different, and in fact, even within the same approximate class, they could have very different types of structures, very different positions. Meant often we had difficulty finding them because you wanted a particular type of position that could do this, and this. And it meant often that in many places we were restructuring quite often. I think our South Sudan mission, for example, has been restructured every year for the last 4 years, in fact. So what we were really thinking of is, well, is it possible that we can look at structures which have common design features and which can be scaled up and down, and which are still flexible but are coherent, and which don't involve us reinventing the wheel in every different location. So those of you familiar with ICSs, you can guess where we're heading now at this point, because this was exactly one of the issues that we were, when we first started thinking about this topic. We had a number of conversations. I think the first point was actually a discussion that you and I had, Paul, about 18 months or 2 years ago on this topic. And then we had a number of conversations with others, including with Steve Goodswood at World Vision. We had some discussions with other emergency responders. We met with the New South Wales Fire Service here in Australia, who've implemented this and have led the rollout of this in a number of other developing countries and a number of other locations. And when we looked at it, one of the things that we were attracted by it was the fact that it starts from something that we found very familiar, which was you start from a set of guiding principles and then you build up from there. And you can see on the screen these are the 5 guiding principles of the Australian incident management system. We ourselves, when we looked at this, we added a 6th at the bottom there, adaptability, which is somewhat implicit in the others. And I mean, if you look at this, some of these were familiar to us already. Unity of command and control, we'd more or less had this concept already in place. We have a single management line that stretches through, which is focused particularly on the head of mission, and that had been more or less always there in MSF. The concept that particular coordinators shouldn't have an excessive span of control. I mean, we'd sometimes breached it in practice, but that had been I think that had been in the last couple of field management manuals. We'd had that in there. Scalability has always been a particular thing that we'd been considering, although as we've gotten larger, I think we've started to get to more or less the limits of what our traditional structures could do. The one that particularly interested us though was this concept of functional management. The point of functional management is to try, as we understood it, is to try to specify what it is that needs to be done in every particular place where we're running an operation. What are the core functions that always must happen? And when we sat down to do this experience, I mean, these are the functions that we came up with, where voice is the functions which in the World Vision in Alexandra's presentation will be covered by more or less by the liaison function in WVI's schema. This is all the activities related to analysis, advocacy, communications, external relations, and so on. I think the others are pretty much self-explanatory. When we looked at that, we realized that actually most of those functions we placed on our heads of mission. Secondly, when we looked at the incident command systems, one of the things that we first noticed is this split between leadership and coordination functions. That what in the this is again the Australian system, the split between incident control and managing operations. Now, this was a relatively new concept to us in some ways, because in our system those two concepts are baked together. So those two, that job is baked into one job, and it's put onto the head of mission, and the head of mission effectively acts as the what we call the traffic controller in any given operation. So by looking at this issue of functional management, it prompted a realization, well, no wonder your heads of mission in particular are overloaded, but also it prompted a realization that perhaps there were ways of splitting up this function that enabled the job to be parceled around a bit more and enabled coordination teams to be expanded in a way which was still coherent, and which also would allow combination of functions within particular people. We'd always considered this more as a factor of posts rather than functions. You know, you always had the same posts, and then you just added new tasks to them. This way of thinking about it meant that we instead were looking at, well, what things do we need to do, and then how many people in this particular place do we need to do that? And that might involve combining functions on one particular person. This could be a head of missions job, for example. This could be a deputy head of missions job, combining the coordination and voice functions. Or you could even give more directly operational functions to the medical coordinator, who presently is very involved in daily operations, but principally in a more technical and advice-making role. And we've been discussing for a while whether we make that job a bit more executive and a bit more, you know, daily decision-making. So that whole concept of functional management, I think, was one that really appealed to us. In terms of how we've done this, so I mean, we had a discussion last year about the overall review and the ideas that we'd found interesting in incident command. We kind of had added into the parameters of the review. Functional management is something that we've taken out of it. I mean, we're not really looking at it as a reintroduction of a new system. We're looking at it more as how can we reinforce our coordinations to improve their jobs, and what ideas, what frameworks can we use to do that. So we're kind of using, we've looked at ICS as more as a bit of an a la carte idea, in which we've taken particular ideas which we found were interesting and are now, have added them to the soup that we've got on the boil. And we've done that, well, partly because organisationally I don't think MSF is all that adapted to massive projects of organisational change. It's not really the way that we do things. It doesn't really fit with the way that most of us think or act, or I'm not sure we'd even know how to do it. But also because our needs in this were different. You see here that we're not specifically talking about emergencies. We're not specifically talking about surge capacity. We have existing mechanisms for that in emergency response units in particular missions, or in emergency desks that each of our operations centres have, or in the fact that if a particular operations centre gets overwhelmed, then they can call for the assistance of other OCs who will then mobilise their resources to come in, which is exactly, for example, what happened in the Ebola emergency, where our Belgian and Swiss colleagues were the first ones who were already there on the ground, and then they called for reinforcements from the rest of the MSF movement. So what we're really looking for is more of our permanent in-mission structures. Another thing that was different between ICSs and their purpose, and this was very clear when we went to talk to the guys from the New South Wales Rural Fire Service, is that the nature of the emergency or the nature of the operation that we're talking about is quite different in timescale. A bushfire might run, a couple of days, a week, maybe a couple of weeks at most. And you're talking more about how you can coordinate the work of a number of different agencies for a very short space of time, and where there's very clear lines of communication, roles, etc., including, for example, you might have people who are in a particular job only for a day. Someone might be an incident commander only for that one day, and then they give it over to the next person. We might have relatively short mission periods, but they're certainly a lot longer than a day. Even in the highest emergencies, they would be months, and in many of the places, we're talking about coordinators will be in place for minimum a year, and now, sometimes 2 years or more. So there were quite a number of things that I would say that we needed to just pick and choose from ICSs as to what was applicable for us, and I would suggest to people listening that if you're thinking about what could be learnt from this for your own organisation, it might be worth doing a bit of an exercise as to what is different about the way that domestic emergency responders act, that is distinct in the kind of emergencies or humanitarian settings that you're working in. And I think I'll leave it there.
Great, Sean. Thank you very much. I find it really interesting that MSF's kind of journey with this is very similar to ours, coming from the same place, which was, identifying the problem of these overwhelmed leaders, people in leadership functions, and then kind of trying to look for an answer to that problem. And our thinking seems to have developed in very similar ways. I'm also particularly taken by this idea of role clarity that both World Vision and MSF have picked up, and splitting out, looking at how many jobs the sort of incident commander is meant to be doing, and saying, well, we can split some of those out, particularly splitting out the planning function from the decision function. So these maybe will be some things that we'll talk about. The first question I'd like to put to maybe start with you, Jimmy, if I may, because you all brought it up in different ways, which is this idea about the applicability of ICS in different contexts. You've looked at it in rapid onset context, in fairly short context, as Sean was just saying. Does this mean that it's only really applicable in short-term rapid incident-type responses, or is it applicable in other contexts, slow onset, protracted, complex emergencies. Jimmy, what's your thinking on that at the moment?
Thank you, Paul. I think to answer that one, I mean, if you ask me, I mean, I will say yes, because I think my answer will be coming back to the, to the set of principles that we've been discussing before in terms of like what the management by objective. So it's not really about whether this is slow onset, whether this is rapid, protracted, complex, what's the objective? That's basically how I see this one. But since, most of my experience has been in a more in a rapid onset, so I can see that easily applied. While that's why in my presentation, actually in the last bit that I did was that need to have more consultation, but not necessarily say that it's not possible, because then we've been using this framework as well in several emergency in Africa, and so far it's okay, but maybe so far it's okay. It's not really there is a major pushback in terms of okay, we cannot use it for a slow onset, but rather that okay, we might need to tweak this one. What we need to tweak, that what I mean by more consultation required. But certainly I think this is applicable, because it should coming back again to the set of principles. This is beyond structure. This is just beyond the box that we are talking. Because if you just see the structure, it might intimidate you. Oh my goodness, how can I finance all these boxes? That's basically also the reaction coming. But it should, I think we should introduce this as a matter of a principle basis discussion. So that's how I answer this, Paul.
Thanks. So some of these principles, I'm guessing principles around the delegation, principles around managing by kind of having a strategic objective, these would be as good for something like Ebola or situations in the DRC as they would be in a rapid onset natural disaster. Sean, I wonder if we could take that, ask you to pick that idea up as well. I mean, you'd mentioned just towards the end of your presentation the timescale issue, and it's, again, the sense I had there was that perhaps maybe because this has been designed for fairly short-term incidents, a couple of weeks you mentioned with bushfires, it might not work for protracted.
Well, I mean, some of the things I think will work, and I think that's really the conclusion that we came from, because there are a number of things in ICSs which I think are still valuable, because as I said, I mean, we weren't specifically interested just in rapid onset or in our emergency operations. I mean, we were interested in it for all of our operations. I mean, greater role clarity, I think, which is one of the core foundation stones of ICSs, is applicable in any kind of operation, and was one of the things that we were most keen on. Similarly, the idea that you build your structures from guiding principles and you keep referring back to those, which ICS is similarly, that's a core idea too, also applicable whatever the circumstance. I mean, I guess the things which are slightly less applicable, there's some of there's quite a bit in ICS in terms of boiling down the particular functions to their most simplest expression. Like, for instance, I've received AIMS training in Australia, and it's supposed to come down to a point where you can receive a small sheet which says that today your job as the logistical coordinator for this bushfire operation is to do these 10 things. And I think that's great in that particular context, but I don't particularly see the need to do that when you're talking about what should the logistical coordinator here in India running 4 different programs at 4 different corners of the country do. So I mean, from our point of view, that's why I say it's a la carte. We found that some things were applicable and interesting, and some of them, I think others, when they look at it, will go, wow, maybe that's not so clear or so useful for us.
Thanks, Sean. I'd like to just stick on this topic for a second, because it does come up a lot, and focus, Alexandra, maybe on this issue of the specific incident objectives. One of our colleagues has asked us, how has World Vision looked at specific incident objectives, again, in a longer term context, in a longer term or protracted crisis? Is that possible to do?
Thanks, Paul. And I think I'd like to come back to the definition we established for management by objective as a principle. One of the reasons we defined our objective as something that's encapsulated in the response strategy is because we recognized, one, that obviously strategy needs to change as the context changes. So your response strategy in the relief phase of a response is obviously going to look very different from in the recovery and rehabilitation phases. So we tried to make that that definition apply to our humanitarian context and mean that EMS, and try to make EMS applicable towards the full phase of an emergency response through the recovery and rehabilitation phases. So Jimmy talked about the Philippines. We're certainly out of the relief phase in the Philippines and into rehabilitation phase. We continue to apply EMS in emergencies in the Syria response, in Haiyan and in other contexts, as Jimmy mentioned. So we see it as very applicable across the life of a response. However, the pieces that need to be tweaked may be different from context to context. So the principles certainly apply in a long-term crisis. I think the functions still need to be represented even in a long-term crisis. The structure may change, so you may move from having a very large structure to having a smaller structure, to a structure that in our case in World Vision may be more integrated with the structure of our national office or our country office. So the structure can be adapted. A lot of the detailed guidance that we've laid out in ICS for our staff for each function, which is contained in terms of reference and standard operating guidance, is primarily targeted to the relief phase because we felt this is where staff needed more detailed guidance, and where also that guidance tends to be fairly similar from one crisis to another in terms of what each function does during the immediate relief phase. And then during the recovery and rehabilitation phase, that changes probably more so from context to context than it does in the relief phase. So I would say it's definitely applicable in long-term crises. Some aspects may be less so, but certainly the principles and the functions are able to be represented across different contexts and different duration of emergencies.
Great, thank you, Alexandra. I'm going to cut right to the chase here then with this second question which we've been asked, which is this really any different? How does this actually mean that things look different on the ground from the way that things were being done before? Or is this just basically good programming, good program management? And if I may, I know this isn't the question that we were asked, but I'll add my own personal thing. How do we know it's making anything better? So could you give us a sense, maybe Jimmy, I could ask you again, of whether from your perspective as someone who's been on the ground a lot, this has actually made a difference. It looks different when it's being implemented, and it actually makes responses better. What are your thoughts on that?
Thank you, Paul. I mean, let me come with a very practical example. For example, during one of the response, in Aceh during the tsunami, during one of the meeting, for example, we need to listen to 20 to 30 people that basically part of the response team to speak and provide their update. It's just maybe you can say easily, oh, this is a poor management, but definitely there is no set of a principle being put in place in terms of the span of control, how to manage that, to manage what's the principle being in place. So that's just one example on how basically having EMS ICS put in place really make a difference. In many of the responses, for example, you have all your CEO, you have all your top leadership coming, and then they tend to also make some contribution in terms of the planning, in terms of the thought, in terms of the suggestion, and sometimes that suggestion, that recommendation make even the operation become more difficult because they're not playing that on their level. That's what we discussed before when Alexandra present the infographic in terms of what is your policy level, what is your strategy level, operational level, and tactical level. Once your CEO said that you need to do this, to do that, it's become very difficult. Then how you can say no? You have to say yes, but somehow it's not necessarily what the operation need to do. So that's part of the, you know, and it's not actually always their mistake, because they just want to help, but they just don't have any parameter what's the level that they need to play with, you know. So that's how this help very helpful, especially to, you know, like the response manager like myself, in terms of playing, you know, okay, what's the role. So this is also how I advise managing up and managing down, in terms of, okay, this is the level that you need to play, and this is the level that people, you know, and the operational side, tactical level need to play. And the other thing, of course, that, you know, been mentioned about the competency requirement, you know, although there are some consequences out of that one, you know, so we could not just place people because of we want to place people, you know. So then basically we filter people for the position, for the job, for the task that required, and we are talking about a very delicate situation, which is emergency response. We need to get the best people on the ground, right? So somehow this principle, you know, help in terms of the competency-based staffing. It's nothing to do in terms of your seniority or how long you've been with the organization. So this is help, you know. This is help in terms of how, if you want to say radical, yes, it's radical. It's not, it's easy, not, it's not easy, because then you're talking about cultural mindset, you know, especially, you know, what's the culture in the organization. But somehow this is help. So that's how I answer it, Paul.
Great, thank you, Jimmy. I mean, that certainly is something that one sees a lot, isn't it? Is the difficulty in asking existing managers, often managers with very high levels of developmental experience at country level, to step aside because their competencies don't necessarily meet the needs of an emergency response. So if you're getting a handle on that, that is a very significant change. Sean, how about MSF? I don't know whether you're far enough down the road to say that, you know, you can actually identify the big changes and benefits, if there are any of those.
No, I'm not sure that you could say that we certainly can't say at this point has this had any impact. We're still much too early in our own process. I mean, we're just at the point of hiring a project manager for you know, planning the rollout of what we intend to do. And to be clear, I mean that what we're intending to do has a number of different aspects which also don't involve ICSs. I mean, for us the main thing is, I mean, our organisation, but any organisation grows, so there has to be some kind of plan as to how that happens. And what we hope is that some of the ideas in this provide us some coherence in the way that our missions grow, and in such a way that they don't that it doesn't become wasteful growth, that it actually does improve the relevance of operations, and that requires some commitment to systematization, some commitment to clear principles, some commitment to you know, some of the things we're actually taking out of ICS. So I put it more in that. Some years down the track, I hope that we will see some benefits of it, and some will be in, you know, a greater degree of coherence in the structures we adopt and implement to run operations.
Great, thanks. So it would be very interesting, by the way, for those of you who have examples of ICS or IMS or similar systems in your own organizations, if you wanted to sort of send those in either now or after the webinar, you know, to give us an idea of what's worked and what hasn't worked. That's something that we could then share. Sean, while you're on the line, we've got a specific question for you, which is from your presentation, are there any occasions where a top-down HQ-led approach is actually best for the context, where it really is best to drive stuff from HQ?
Yeah, no, I mean, actually, to be honest with you, we had an explicit discussion with this, and our answer, the answer that we came up with was yes. When we were discussing all of this, I mean, one of the things that we brought in, and it's in the concept of adaptability I showed you when we talk about, you know, what should our guiding principles be? Adaptability was one, in which case it means that different types of interventions should have different structures and different ways of working. And one was that, you know, the more emergency it is, we have an emergency desk model which is really quite centralized and top-down, and we actually we decided that we didn't particularly have a problem with that. So that, you know, if you're talking about, you know, the really well, it's not necessarily that they're rapid onset, but the emergencies that have fallen under our emergency desk. So presently, I think the Syria desk, the Syrian conflict falls under our emergency desk. A lot of the direction of that goes through the line, and it goes from the e-desk manager to the emergency coordinator on the ground to the teams, and it's much more top down. And you know, our own organisational culture doesn't actually have much of a problem with top down. We just think that in places where we don't really need to do it, and we can have a more collaborative approach and a more shared approach, that we should do so. And our review did say that, you know, in situations where that's applicable, that's the path we should take. So yeah, no, look, from our point of view, it's not you know, certain types of approaches should be taken from the point of view of principle. It's very much what will improve the operation, what will improve the program in this particular place at this particular time, and sometimes, yeah, that involves a greater degree of direction.
Great, thank you, thank you. So this flexibility piece and kind of adapting your approach to context is shining through as an important element, while still maintaining, you know, that's flexibility, as I understand it, within a structure and a basic understanding of strategic objectives. And that brings me maybe to two related questions. I think I'll ask them together, if I may. Up on the screen, the second and third questions. Both of these are about, I mean, we've talked about World Vision as an organization, and we've talked about MSF as an organization using incident management, emergency management, incident command systems internally. How does that work then when your organization is fitting into a larger context, particularly the larger context of the state? So do you find that there might be conflict between you know, World Vision and the state if you're implementing ICS? And what about other receiving bodies, so non-state bodies but actors on the ground, other actors on the ground? Is there conflict with them when you come in with this, you know, fairly structured system? Jimmy, have you any experience of this?
Okay, let me come back again with the you know, especially coming from my example, you know, where I was working in Haiyan. Basically, when I come and then start talking with the people at the national office, I mean the existing office, you know, where basically they are the one that will receive you know, assistance coming from, you know, from the global team. What I say to them, you know, that it takes two to tango. So it's just very difficult if just, you know, like us, you know, the response team that need to ensure that things will be all right, things will be fine, things will be, people will be, you know, will understand this. You know, it takes two. So then that you know, the receiving office, the you know, the one that you just mentioned here, you know, that need also to play their part. But I guess the part that we can do, actually, according to me, it was two. One is really to talk about you know, the principle-based discussion start from the beginning. Why we are doing this? You know, what's the objective? Because the shared objective will help us, you know, both sides actually to understand why we are doing this. And then the second one, I guess, which is very critical also, to clarify roles that existing office will play. You know, the one that will receive this, you know, then be use ICS EMS, that what is their role? Because I don't believe that their role will diminish. No, I don't think. You know, it's just changing role. They are the one who is in charge before. Now the role is changed because of the context. So what? So how to clarify that one? I think again I need to come back to the presentation that that we share here. The existing office still have the role, which is, when they develop the strategy. There is no way that the search capacity like us could help develop the strategy without the, without the input, without the input from the existing office. So that's how I think, to clarify in terms of, one, start talking, use the principle-based discussion, and second, also to clarify what roles. And this not only a one-off discussion. This needs to be repeat in order. I guess it's very, in order not to create unnecessary conflict. Conflict will always be there. I don't want to say that everything will be happy, then everybody will accept this. No, but just need to keep clarifying in terms of roles, because then I was in the position before also that as an existing office and receive assistance from outside. It's not always easy. I understand the feeling. So I think that's how to mitigate this issue. Hopefully I answered that. Thanks, Paul.
And I'm guessing that this is also an area where, the more Alexandra was talking about the kind of work that needs to be done in the organization, and Sean in a very different organizational context. This is where, the more this is used and becomes understood, the more likely, the less friction there is likely to be, because everyone is kind of talking the same language. I'd like to move on to another question which has come in, because it relates, it bridges us nicely to our next webinar, which is going to be about taking this outside the single organization to look at how instant command or unified command can be used across a variety of organizations. And one of our participants has asked, Alexandra, do you think it's possible for a universal adaptation of ICS or EMS to happen across humanitarian organizations? Can you imagine a world where, all of the, say, members of the humanitarian coordination team were using one single EMS? Would it be worth it, and what would be the key challenges, do you think?
Thanks, Paul. I think it's happening more and more. So there's, 2 agencies on this webinar. We know many other agencies are also either have adopted ICS or moving towards adopting ICS. So there's clearly a recognition that ICS works in a humanitarian context and it adds value to individual agencies. We haven't, we've done some simulation work across agencies where ICS has been applied, but we haven't, maybe Jimmy would know more, but I'm not familiar with these discussions taking place actually during a response, trying to organize across agencies. I don't see why it couldn't happen, because as we talked about the change from what existed before to an ICS structure being radical, but it's also in many ways quite simple in terms of the concepts. When it's quite logical. Everything that's contained in ICS is very logical and almost intuitive. Taking it to its point of natural conclusion is quite radical in terms of ways of operating. So I think in terms of adopting the principles, adopting the functions, I don't see why it couldn't happen across agencies. I think trying to take it to its natural conclusion in terms of decision-making processes, that would probably require some more work. But agencies like the UN are also adopting ICS in their emergency management. So as more and more agencies adopt it within their emergency functions and their organizations, it seems the next logical step is then starting to talk across agencies. Well, is this the model we should be looking at, at a coordination level, at an operational level across agencies? World Vision in many ways, because it's multi-mandated, in some ways sort of replicates what multiple ways of thinking might look like, and ICS really brings the ability to be able to bring those different ways of thinking and different ways of working together through common terminology, through common kind of objectives. So I think it can work.
Thank you, Alexandra. And of course, that's a good reminder that quite a number of other organizations are investigating or implementing elements of this, particularly our colleagues at the World Food Programme, for example, who, along with World Vision, were very engaged in the research that we were doing, and I know are taking steps to move these ideas forward. Perhaps we'll hear from them in a future webinar. We're moving up to time now, so what I'd like to do is just ask, as a last question, just one sentence, one recommendation that you'd make based on your experience so far to other organizations who were interested in some form of incident management or incident command system. Sean, what would your top recommendation be?
I think one of the best things that we did is we actually went and sat with some of our domestic emergency responders and had them explain the way that they function to us, because in many ways these are both similar and different people to us. I mean, we felt right at home in talking to them. They're just in a vastly different context, and that actually, and then us laying out our problems to them and having them comment on them, that was an extremely useful process, even if we, you're not talking about, introducing the ICS as a system. Even from that point of view, as a learning, it was a really very, very valuable experience.
And what about the World Vision? Jimmy, one learning that you've got, one thing that you would share from the field perspective?
I think, yeah, thanks, Paul. I guess, based on the experience that we had, 2010 to 2012 is very painful. It's not easy. It's easy to share here, but it's not easy when we did. But I guess it was paid off during Haiyan. I mean, like everybody across the organization realized that one. So invest a lot on the awareness raising, on this ICS thing, why it's working, what's not working, and then started to discuss across the organization. So I guess that's how my one thing that I would recommend to other organizations. Thanks, Paul.
I think it's really interesting that both Jimmy and Sean, you're both bringing up this. It's not so much about the ICS, it's about the implementation and how people respond to it, and the organizational change element of that, which I think that's a really interesting idea, one we should follow further. Thank you so much, all three of you. Thank you, Alexandra. Thank you, Jimmy. Thank you, Sean. I think we've learned a lot from this, and there's a vast amount more that we need to learn from the experiences of both your organizations and of the other organizations in the ALNAP membership and beyond who've been using this system. And thank you to all of you who participated and sent in your questions. Before we close, I'd just like to ask our participants to fill out a couple of polls which you will see appearing on the screen now. We'd just like to get an idea of, kind of where we sit with this. So could you possibly select one of these statements about how applicable you think ICS is for the humanitarian sector and in your own organizational context? Majority have voted now. And it's coming down to about half of our participants think that there are elements of ICS we should implement as soon as possible, a quarter that you should implement the whole thing as soon as possible, and a quarter that my organization should learn more about it and consider it. Sorry, as the votes change, we now have 5% also who's saying it might be a good idea but won't work for my organization. But so there seems to be quite a lot of interest in going down this path, which is, I think, reassuring, but also suggests that we need to identify a bit more on the basis of the conversations we've had what those elements are. One thing that we've been thinking about is whether we should be trying to put together some kind of workshop to explore these possibilities. This would not be in 2015, but perhaps something convened by ALNAP early in next year. And we just wanted, again, to just use those of you who've participated to get a sense of whether you think this would be worth it. So may I ask you, fingers on buzzers, to just fill out this poll again. Would this be a useful thing for you? The majority of the responses that we've got, slightly over half, are absolutely, it's a very welcome next step. About a third are probably, and the remaining are split between not sure and not a priority for me. Okay. So some interest, some significant interest there. That's certainly something then that that the team here at ALNAP should think more about. And if you have any suggestions as to the kind of topics that we should be thinking to cover in a workshop or in future webinars, do please let us know by email. I'd just like, before we go, to point out a couple of things. First of all, from the last webinar, there's a lot of e-learning that our colleagues in FEMA suggested that you can go straight to here, and we're putting the links up. And also, a colleague from the US Coast Guard has just also shared a very useful handbook there, which is the link in the bottom right-hand corner. So, all it remains for me to do is to thank you all once again and to invite you to join us at our next webinar, which will be on April the 1st, where we will be looking at the potential for using this in a multi-organizational context, so taking it beyond the single organization and going to groups of organizations. We will be sending out a survey to you immediately after this, or at least after this. I'm not sure how immediately it will be, and it would be really helpful to have some feedback from those of you who've taken the trouble and the time to participate in terms of what you thought of this webinar and where you think we should be taking this agenda in the future. So good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you've joined us from. Thank you very much for joining, and a big virtual round of applause for our three presenters. Thank you very much for that.